Financial Pickle here. What if I said you can do an options trade on DWAC that would outperform the stock by 50%? If DWAC goes up 10%, you make 60%. If it goes down 50%, you lose nothing. That would sound too good to be true, right? What kind of crazy make-believe land am I living in? If that was a thing, then why would people buy the shares? Well, it's actually possible by doing something called a synthetic. A synthetic is when you create something that mimics something else, like imitation vanilla, jeggings, or Beyond Meat. With the stock market, you're generally using options to create those imitations. There are several different types of synthetics, but for this video, we'll mainly be looking at a synthetic long stock, which means we're trying to replicate the profit and loss of owning the stock, but instead of owning the stock, we're using options. But a synthetic long stock works a little bit differently than normal for DWAC. But before I get into that, let me first tell you about how a synthetic long stock normally works. Here's a profit and loss chart for owning a stock. In case you haven't seen these before, they show what your profit or loss would be if the stock moved to a certain point. The price per share is on the x-axis and the profit or loss is on the y-axis. As you probably would have guessed, if you own the stock, you make money as it goes up and you lose money as it goes down. Pretty simple, right? Now let's recreate this using a synthetic long stock. This involves buying an at-the-money call and selling an at-the-money put. At-the-money means you're using a strike that is equal to or very close to the current price of the stock. On most stocks, the premium on the calls and puts will be very similar. The goal is generally to have the short put pay for the long call or very close to it. Here's what the profit and loss chart looks like for a long call. You make money as the stock goes up and your max loss is the premium paid. And here's what the profit and loss chart looks like for a short put. You lose money as the stock goes down and your max gain is the premium received. If you combine the two, it looks just like the profit and loss chart for a long stock, which is why it's called synthetic long stock. Now here's how DWAC is different. This is a synthetic long stock on DWAC with an expiration date about 1 year out. What do you notice about the option premiums here that's different than our example? The put option is much more expensive than the call option. This means if we open this synthetic long stock and get an execution at the midpoint, we will pay $12.28 for the long call and receive $34.55 for the short put, for a net credit of $22.28. When you get a credit, your break-even is the strike price minus the credit. We got a credit of $22.28, so our break-even is $22.28 lower than the 50 strike, which is $27.72. That's $22.94 lower than the 50.66 stock price, which is 45%. This means if you hold the options until expiration, you don't lose unless the stock falls more than 45%. The $22.94 helps you on the way up too. No matter where the stock goes, this trade will get you an extra $22.94 per share versus the stock if you hold it until the expiration date. But there's a way to get this outperformance number even higher than 45%. To do that, we just need to raise our strike from 50 to 180. This gets you a credit of 155.18, which means the break-even is 24.82 versus the 27.72 it was before. That's 25.84 lower than the current price, or 51%, rather than 22.94 or 45%. However, there is a potential downside to raising the strike like this, but I'll get to that later in the video. So if you can outperform the stock by 51% no matter which direction it goes, then why would anyone buy the shares, and why does this large difference in the puts and calls even exist? First, let me explain why the large difference generally doesn't exist and how there might be an arbitrage opportunity if it did exist. If you didn't know, arbitrage means getting a riskless profit due to mispricing in the market. I'll use the DWAC trade with 50 strikes as an example. Let's pretend the option prices are switched so that the call is $34.55 and the put is $12.28. What you can do to take advantage of that is do a synthetic short stock and also buy the shares. A synthetic short stock is the exact opposite of a synthetic long stock, so we would be selling the call instead of buying and buying the put instead of selling. And combined we get the same $22.28 credit as before. Now if you add the long stock position, the two positions cancel each other out because one is long stock and the other is short stock. And because of the $22.28 credit, your profit would be $21.62 no matter where the stock goes. It's a little bit less than the $22.28 because the call is in the money and you're short, so it counts against you. It's kind of like shorting the stock at $71.62 and buying it back at $50, but you have to wait for the options to expire to get the full $21.62 profit. This is why it's uncommon for calls to be worth more than puts for at-the-money options with the same expiration. Someone could take advantage of it with that trade and profit from the difference. There are situations, however, where calls are worth more than puts and it's not an arbitrage opportunity, and it has to do with interest rates. I'll explain that in more detail in another video. Now let's look at the trade again with the actual prices where the put is more than the call. To take advantage of it, we can do a synthetic long stock like we talked about earlier, where we're selling the put and buying the call. Then we short the stock so that the short stock and synthetic long stock cancel each other out. But because of the 22.28 credit, our profit would be 22.94 no matter where the stock goes. It's a little bit more than the 22.28 credit because the call is in the money and we're long, so that works in our favor. So then why does such a big difference in premium exist if someone can do this to profit 22.94? Well, the thing is, you probably can't profit 22.94, and the reason is mainly because of the hard to borrow fee associated with shorting. When you short a stock, you're borrowing shares from someone who owns them, and sometimes there's a fee for doing this. This fee will take a huge chunk out of that $22.94, or possibly even the whole thing and more if the hard to borrow fee is high enough. There is also no guarantee you can hold a short stock position as long as you want, like you can with a long stock. You could be forced to close the short position early if the shares are no longer available to borrow, or there might not even be shares to open the short position at all. So the hard to borrow fee, potential forced buybacks, and possible inability to short allows this premium difference to exist, because otherwise there would be an arbitrage opportunity. People would take advantage of it, causing the prices to change, and the opportunity would quickly go away. But just because a stock has a hard to borrow fee or no shares available to short, that doesn't mean this premium difference will always be there. It just means it's a lot more likely to be there. When someone is bearish on a stock, there are several trades they can do to try to profit. It would mostly involve shorting the stock, selling calls, or buying puts. If you short the stock, it becomes more likely it will be hard to borrow or have a higher hard to borrow fee because the available shares to lend for shorting would be lower. If you sell calls, you're driving their price down, and if you buy puts, you're driving their price up. If enough people do this, it will cause the puts to be worth more than the calls. And if enough people short the stock, then this means there is no arbitrage opportunity when that happens because of the hard to borrow fee and a possible forced buyback of the short. So there has to be a general bearish sentiment on the stock in order for the premium difference to exist. So that's pretty much it for the trade. Now I'll go over some additional information that would be helpful to know before you do the trade yourself. The 51% outperformance on the trade doesn't happen immediately. As time goes on, the options will lose value due to time decay. The puts that you are short will lose more time value than the calls that you are long, so you will slowly accumulate that 51% as the time decay happens. You have to hold the options through the expiration date to get the full 51%. The further out the expiration date is, the higher the number will be. 3 weeks out gets you about 6%, 3 months gets you about 20%, and my 1 year example gets you about 51%. You can get out of the trade before the options expire, however, if you do, you might not outperform the stock. The delta value of an option position shows approximately how much it would change if the stock went up $1. The delta value on the 50 strike trade is about 0.78, which means if the stock goes up $1, that trade would gain about 78 cents. And the delta on the 180 strike trade is about 0.49. This means if the stock made a quick move up, then the stock would likely do better than the options, and the 50 strike trade would likely do better than the 180 strike trade. If the stock went down quick, it would likely be the opposite, where the stock would lose the most, the 50 strike trade would lose a little less, and the 180 strike trade would lose the least. There is also the time decay factor on the options, which is getting you a small amount of the outperformance number each day. The 180 strike trade has more time decay than the 50 strike trade. So if the move on the stock is slower and more gradual, then the options will likely outperform the stock, with the 180 strike likely doing better than the 50 strike. There is also the potential for the hard to borrow fee or overall sentiment on the stock to change, which may cause the difference between the calls and puts to change, which would change your profit or loss on the position. But if the choices are to do a synthetic long stock and hold it through expiration, or hold the actual stock for the same period, then the synthetic long stock is the clear winner, with the one providing the highest outperformance number doing the best. As with anything on the channel, this is not a recommendation for anyone to do any specific trade. I'm just providing education about a particular strategy. DWAC is not the only stock this can be done on. It was just the best example I could find that provided the biggest outperformance versus the stock. Another stock this can be done on is ARQQ, which gives about 35% extra for 7 months. Unfortunately, I don't know of a great way to find more. One of the best ways is probably to screen for stocks with high short interest and look at a synthetic long trade on those stocks. It's best to avoid doing the trade on stocks with dividends unless you really know what you're doing. You don't get any dividends with a synthetic long stock like you do when you own the shares. So if the stock will be paying any dividends during the duration of your trade, then the synthetic long stock will have to pay you more to offset that. You might also be throwing away money by holding a long call into an ex-dividend date, but I'll explain that more in another video. It is possible for you to get assigned early on the short put, however it isn't likely unless the put is in the money and has very little or no time value left. And this is a little more likely to happen with the 180 strike versus the 50 strike. If it happens, it's not that big of a deal. The biggest drawback is having to spend cash to buy the shares, but it doesn't change your max loss, and you would be getting the 51% outperformance number early, or whatever percentage was applicable to your trade. In my examples, I was using the midpoint for the calculations, and you may or may not get a trade execution at that price. The spreads on DWAC options aren't that wide, so the midpoint, or slightly worse than the midpoint, is somewhat realistic as an execution price. But even if we use the ask price on the 180 strike trade, which is sort of a worst case scenario, it still gives you 44% outperformance. So that's how to outperform DWAC stock by almost 50%. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed the video, please don't forget to subscribe. And as always, stay out of the pickle jar.